Okay, we've just gone live. Hi, everyone. My name is Rakim Brooks, President of Alliance for Justice. We're just going to take a few minutes to allow people to join across the multiple streaming platforms for this holding court with Ken Grossinger regarding his new book, Artworks. So just give us a second. We'll probably start in a minute or so. Okay, good. All right, well, that's a good place to start. Looks like we've got over 100 guests thus far. Good afternoon again. My name is Rakim Brooks, and I'm president of Alliance for Justice. For those of you who don't know, AFJ is an organization of more than 150 other organizations committed to building power, transforming courts, and securing justice for all. Today's conversation is part of our ongoing series, Holding Court, Justice Conversations with AFJ, featuring leading activists, scholars, and attorneys to discuss the current political and social justice issues of our time. I'm honored to have Ken Grossinger, DeRay Mckesson, and Maggie Bruns with us today on Holding Court to discuss Ken's new book, just recently released, Artworks: How Organizers and Artists Are Creating a Better World Together. Before we get to the substance of our discussion, of course, a few brief introductions. So Ken is the person of the hour, and we'll get started with him. Ken has been a leading strategist in movements for social and economic justice for 35 years, serving in senior roles across unions and community organizations, and now as director of impact philanthropy at Democracy Partners. Artworks is Ken's first book, I think, channeling all those years of experience and treasured relationships. If you see the blurbs, you'll know how many people Ken has gotten to know over the many years who really value his insights into this space. But again, this is his first book, and so we're just so honored that he would share it with us and allow us to bring it to all of you. Ken is also a former board chair of AFJ, so I want to personally thank him for his contributions to AFJ and the time when he served on our board and for continuing to be a good friend to us. So thank you, Ken. DeRay Mckesson is also a board member, a little board heavy, but these are great people to have. So he's a civil rights activist focused primarily on issues of innovation, equity, and justice. DeRay has advocated for issues related to children, youth, and families, and serves as co-founder and leader of Campaign Zero. He's also, as many of you know, a co-host of Pod Save the People. So thank you for joining us, DeRay. And last but not least, we have Maggie Bruns. Maggie leads Prairie's River Network, which works to protect water, heal the land, and inspire the change that both science and justice require of us in this moment. After weeks of scorching temperatures around the country, we should all be hoping she succeeds, and soon. Maggie got her start in environmental advocacy at PRN as a student volunteer, helping to organize our river cleanups and providing general office support. Maggie also knows a thing or two about integrating art into advocacy campaigns, and there'll be more on that to come. But for now, Maggie, we're so glad that you should join us for this conversation. All right, so I'm going to jump right in. As I said, we'll go to Ken. You've been laboring on behalf of progressive causes for more than 3 decades. I'm not trying to date you. That's just the fact of the matter. And it's at this point in your career that you've chosen to write a book, a story, in fact, about, as you put it, organizers who brought artists to their strategy table and artists who deployed their artwork in the service of social movements. So why this story and why now?
First, let me say thank you to you, Rakim, for inviting the 3 of us to join with you today, and thank you for your leadership at the Alliance for Justice. Also, thanks to DeRay, whose work I've tracked long distance, although not so far. I live in Washington, D.C. DeRay is in Baltimore, but I know him as an anti-racist activist in Baltimore, and am proud to share the screen with him. And thanks to Maggie, too, who I know as one of the first people that I know, actually, who integrated art, incorporated it into the work of the League of Conservation Voters. So this is it's a wonderful group. It's great to be here. And I was inspired to write this book because, like all activists who are online today, I want to strengthen our capacity to win. That was really my motivating force. I've organized in the labor and among labor and community organizations most of my life. And I've been struck over the 20 plus years of my career in labor and community organizations, I've been struck that when I learned to think about organizing, art and culture were never a part of what I learned. And so when I practiced organizing, it's not something I did. And when I started teaching younger organizers how to think about organizing, it, of course, was also not a part of the mix. Art is something that I define broadly to include music, film, theater, poetry, painting, sort of the gamut. And so while it was organizers not embracing art and culture on the scale that they needed to, that started me out, it was also the realization through my work in philanthropy that artists also didn't think about their work in strategic ways. Many artists think about their work as individual forms of political expression, but don't see their work in the service of social movements. And so what I think is that one strategy that we can embrace to be more impactful is linking art and organizing. And so I wanted to write a book that demonstrates how that works.
Yeah, well, I think you succeeded. DeRay, let me turn to you. In the first chapter of Ken's book, he's really reflecting on the role of arts in the civil rights movement and the Black Lives Matter movements. Our audience is likely familiar with the power of song throughout the civil rights movement. There was a particular quote that I really loved from Cortland Cox, who was a SNCC organizer, who said, "Song helped thaw some of the fear." And of course, he referred to some of the fear in confronting Jim Crow in Mississippi at that time. You were on the ground in the earliest days of Ferguson after Mike Brown was killed, long before there was actual national media attention confronting what we now know to be one of the most aggressive local police forces in the country. I'm curious, was there any art at that time for you that also helped, in Cox's words, to thaw some of the fear?
Yeah, that's such an interesting way to put it. That the art was incredibly important, and I think about it both as an outlet and a container. So, we were outside for a long time. It was a long time, and after a point, you're like, okay, so what can you do? It's like the chants and the songs kept us like excited, kept us energized, and Black people are so creative. So some of the songs were bops. You're like, that was a good. You're like, that was a good chant. You're like, that was good. And it was so democratized. So anybody who like both believed and understood and had rhythm can help. And in those early days, we knew those things more than we knew each other's names. Like we didn't know anybody's names in the first 40 days. Like I knew I could identify you. I was the guy in the red shorts before I was the guy in the blue vest to people. But excuse me, I remember the people who like made the first chants. I remember those first chants. Like, I mean, they really kept us together. And that art was like the paperclip of the moment in so many ways. I don't know if we would have stayed outside as long as we did. We were outside till 2 a.m. to 3 a.m., if not for the chants and the songs keeping the energy constant. We were still afraid. So, I think Cortland was talking about something a little different, but it definitely was the catalyst for the energy and kept the energy flowing. And I think that was true. We were in the street for 400 days, and it was 400 days of chants and songs and images that really kept the energy constant when the police were trying to dampen our spirit.
Yeah. Has that been collected anywhere? I mean, Ken does some of that work, I think, in the book, but I'm just curious from your perspective and sort of movement leaders at that time, have we captured it and sort of kept it as an archive to carry forward?
We did keep it. Yeah, we if not only because when the protests spread across the country, there were organizers calling us, being like, what was that chant? They were like, we heard that chant. What was it? And it's like, here it is. And like, this is how we said it, or how did you do this? And that was actually really cool to see people like take and make their own. And some of the chants were brilliant. I'm like, that was good,
I don't know how it works to read a small segment from the book online, but
Please.
I'd like to give it a try to build on what DeRay is saying. This is a quote from Wyatt T. Walker, who was the director of the faith-based civil rights organization Southern Christian Leadership Conference, talking about the power of one song, We Shall Overcome. And he says, one cannot describe the vitality and emotion this one song evokes across the Southland. I have heard it sung in great mass meetings with 1,000 voices singing as one. I've heard a half dozen sing it softly behind the bars of the Hinds County Prison in Mississippi. I've heard women singing it on the way to work in Albany, Georgia. I've heard the students singing it as they're being dragged away to jail. It generates power that's indescribable.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that, Ken. And don't worry, I'm going to quote from the book plenty, but that was a perfect interjection. Maggie, let me bring you into this. Going further in the book, the second chapter, actually, Ken talks about the environmental movement and art. And I just love this quote from Bill McKibben, who's always colorful. But this was 2005, and he said, where are the books, the poems, the plays, the goddamn operas? And so you know the environmental movement well, and he wrote that in 2005. By 2006, we had An Inconvenient Truth. And so art has obviously been gaining currency and momentum in the environmental movement, and you've used it in some of your own work. So I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk about that connection between art and preserving our planet.
Sure, thank you. I will say in response to that quote, and supporting the youth climate strike movement over the last several years now, one of the first things that those young leaders did was organize an art build for every event that they were doing. So the message has been heard. I think the movement is moving in that direction. But for us, or for when I was with the League of Conservation Voters and League of Conservation Voters Education Fund, for me, there was a reflection point on the 2016 election and just seeing how much culture played into that election, and knowing that we weren't going to break through and make progress until we started to kind of, I don't want to say leverage, but fill those inputs, cultural inputs through song, through poems, through butter art. I did everything, crop art, you name it, I've been there. And so until we started to kind of fill those voids in our movement, we weren't going to move forward. And so I'll end there.
Yeah. Well, why don't you say a bit more about that? So you recognize that because this is one of Ken's key themes, right? That actually it's culture that causes political change to take hold. And there still needs to be a necessary conversation between artists and organizers. But you seem to have recognized that you were in a moment where the organizing wasn't going to be enough, if there was going to be a cultural transformation. I just love to hear sort of how you came to that and what really you were wrestling with.
I think it's like a nonprofit, mindset where you're trying to use every dollar wisely. Mm-hmm. And so is policy going to shift culture? Sometimes, yes, but can you build the culture that you're looking for and shift the policy that way too? So you need to be investing in both of those arms. And I think for us, traditional political organizers, they were kind of dismissive of some of my ideas at first until they came out and they saw it, right? We did a big ice sculpture in front of the Brooklyn Public Library on a really hot day. And, those imageries and the kids coming up and interacting with it, like you reach people much more authentically. If I'm standing out there with a clipboard being like, hey, sign my petition to pass X, Y, or Z, people are going to, you know how you do. Everyone here does it, right? You look down and you act like you're on your phone. But if you're out there with art, people naturally come up and talk to you. Sometimes I don't even put climate on the art, right? Not me, but the artist, because it's supposed to inspire them to conversation. And that's what we really invested in over the last several years. And I think it changed the way the LCV organized, and it for me personally as well. In terms of my future, I will find the money to do this work going forward. That's for sure.
Yeah. Ken, that raises a question for me, because I read your book as partially a plea for exactly what Maggie achieved, right? Which was art played such a pivotal role in the way that the clipboard couldn't. And you're trying to make the connection between the two. You point out that there's a wonderful quote at some point where you're talking about the kind of view of the artist and the view of the organizer and how they have to merge, that the organizer is thinking about policy and maybe short-term wins, maybe political realignments. The artist is thinking about cultural transformation over the long term. So what is it that you really think is the burden or the barrier to the collaborations? So obviously they're taking place, but is there still something lingering, or do you think we've now passed the moment where now, my generation and subsequent generations just kind of expect that these two things will work hand in hand?
Definitely don't think we've passed the moment. And I think the moment is exacerbated. This problem is exacerbated by the funding streams and so forth. And I would point to sort of 4 areas in terms of the barriers of collaboration. I should also say in terms of the opportunities that they're endless. There isn't a campaign in this world where art and culture hasn't been or shouldn't be part of what we do. But the barriers are real. Organizers, and I know this from my experience, think in terms of metrics. How many doors did I knock on? How many phone calls did I make? How many people showed up at my demonstration? How many pieces of legislation can we submit before we get the right legislation? So organizers think about kind of those metrics, whereas artists don't look at quantitative metrics, they look at qualitative metrics. And some people argue that qualitative metrics is just a subjective matter. I'm not so sure that it is, but I'm sure that that keeps the artists and organizers apart, because organizers don't want to invest in something that isn't a sure thing. And artists take the viewpoint that anything that you think is a sure thing is not going to move the needle as far as we need to move it, because it stays within convention. So metrics are sort of one measure. Time frame is another. Organizers want things done yesterday. They want things done now. They want things done next week. We all do. Artists, on the other hand, think about their work in a more long-term way. 1 year, 5 years, 10 years. Hank Willis Thomas said he thinks about it in terms of 10, 20, 30, and 40 years. And that's because what artists are trying to do is shift the narratives, right? We know that political protest and organizing can lead to policy and legislative victories. But we also know when power changes hands, those victories often get rolled back. And that's largely because we don't deal with the narratives underlying those fights. And so we continue to have the same fights over and over. So the time frame is important. The messaging is important. You and the League of Conservation Voters and a lot of other organizations put a lot of money into polling. What messages are going to work? Artists think differently. Take that song, "We Shall Overcome." Take an image. They don't want to be constrained by the messaging, and they think that they have something to offer that's slightly different and out of the box. And finally, I would say, and then I'll close on this point because I'm watching the clock. Foundations can play a very dysfunctional role in this. Many foundations fund organizing over here and fund art and culture over here. And so if you're an artist like Mel Chin, who wanted to remediate lead in the soil following Katrina, you have to decide whether you're going to apply for money for the art or for the organizing. That causes us to, that causes us to go different routes. And it doesn't bring organizers and artists together. It separates them. It puts them in a competitive position. So there are real obstacles to this, and I think those are some of them.
Yeah, thank you. DeRay, Ken's point about data reminds me of you and Campaign Zero, because I know a good bit about your work, and I know it is data heavy. It is big data. And so I'm actually curious how you balance the relationship between art, which I know you're quite enthusiastic about, and its role in cultural change as an organizational leader, thinking about policymakers who need hard data to move them from where they are to where you'd like them to go.
Yeah, I think the data piece is right. We're trying to figure out how to scale change, and I need to I need to think through the pieces and the components. I think what art allows us to do though is think about the entrances and on ramps for people a little differently. So some people come to this because they just like get the policy. They're like, that is racist or crazy, or the policy shouldn't be like this. But a lot of people, policy is not their thing, and that's not their fault. So the question becomes like, how do we help people enter into the space differently? I think about some of the pieces of art that I think have done that really well. There's an art exhibit that was in New York City that was phone booths. It was like reclaimed phone booths. And when you picked up the phone, it was happy birthday messages to people who have been killed by the police. And I've been to essentially everything about police violence for the last 10 years, every exhibit, every whatever. And let me tell you, I just bust out crying at that exhibit because I just hadn't seen the issue presented that way. And it was like a very different way to like enter into the conversation. I think art does that really well. Another one around prisons that there was a show house in Brooklyn that had an acrylic rendering of Khalif Browder's cell. And it was so powerful for my friends to be like, that's where he lived. And you're like, yeah, how big do you think jail is? Like, it's not a hotel. What did you think this was? They were like, that's really small. I'm like, yes. And it was like beautiful acrylic, but it was like the exact dimensions. And it was like, art could do that better than any speech I gave, any talk. And Maggie, have you seen the documentary, The Smell of Money?
I haven't, but I'll check it out.
Yes. It's like, I think environmental issues sound a little frou-frou to a lot of people. Not to me, but I think you're just like, And I saw this documentary and I'm like, when am I going to North Carolina? Me and my sister, like my friends were like, when are we going? Who has the bus? Because we need to go do something. And it's like the storytelling that art does across mediums allows people to just enter into complicated things much easier than a speech or an essay often allows, especially for people who policy is not the way they just start thinking about the world.
Yeah.
I have a couple of images that could illustrate DeRay's point.
Sure.
Lizzie, if you can pull up the first. Need I say more? Lizzie, pull up the next. So I wanted to talk about an historical example and a contemporary example of the way in which art is not just a reflection or a reaction to social movements, but a contributor to them. So in 1963, in Leesburg, Georgia, 33 teenage girls were imprisoned in the Leesburg stockade for protesting racial segregation. Danny Lyon, the photographer who took this photo, said that they were all but lost to the world other than their families. And so SNCC used this image, brought it to Congress, who entered it into the congressional record. It went up to the Attorney General's office, who was Robert Kennedy at the time. And within the next day, these girls were released. So in this sense, one form of art, photography, contributed, not just reflected or was a reaction to social movements. Let's go to the next slide. So this is one DeRay may or may not be familiar with. This is something that I've experienced personally, and is one of the things that turned me on to the whole idea of cultural strategy. There is an artist in Baltimore named Justin Nethercutt, who does a lot of street murals, and a housing organizer named Carol Ott. And the two of them got together and wanted to do something about the blighted buildings in Baltimore. As DeRay knows, and others who know Baltimore, it's one of the last of the East Coast cities that have rows and rows and rows of dilapidated homes. And so they not just wheat pasted and painted murals onto these sides of these dilapidated buildings, but they put a QR code on them. And when you scan the QR code that you can see to the right of the beak of the raven, up pops the name of the slumlord, and up pops the name of the political districts in whose buildings those where those buildings are. And so the reaction to this was Nether had the QR code taken down immediately, and 2 days later pulled it back up. And within 2 weeks, if you can imagine how long it takes to get a license for demolition in any place, particularly in cities, this building was taken down within 2 weeks. And this happened over and over and over the course of 15 murals, so much so that the mayor in 2013 built up their demolition budget for city-owned properties from $2.2 million to $20+ million. So in this sense, too, art was a contributor, not just a reaction or a reflection of ongoing issues.
I'm really glad you shared those images and that story in particular, because that was one of my favorite from the book.
I was going to stop there.
Okay, yeah, well, we've only got DeRay for a few more minutes, so I'm going to go back to him and then bring Maggie back into the conversation. There's a series of questions I wanted to ask her. But DeRay, one of the things your last comment and Ken's, I don't know, it agitated in me is once you talked about different entry points. So once you've got people into the new entry point, how is it that you create staying power? Is that even necessary? So you created new awareness for someone, but I'm sure there have been plenty of folks. I'm remembering an experience of my own where we went to go see Fruitvale Station, and I remember how moved everyone in the audience was in a way that Ken describes it. Just after the film ends, people were in tears. It felt like a moment where folks could do something. And then I have wondered since, what did everybody go and do because of that? So how is it that you capture energy once people have sort of opened themselves up to change?
Yeah, I think the example that Ken just gave is a beautiful one, that people often know when things don't make sense. Like everybody in Baltimore is like, we know the houses, we know it. Like they don't, you don't need to give a speech about their vacant homes. People don't know what to do after that. And the QR code is such a brilliant, like saying, here are the landlords, here are the people, such a brilliant thing. We think about it often as like a ladder of organizing. Like people just need to be ready to, like, you need to help people take one step. And after they take one step, they can take another step. And I worry sometimes that people try to make people leap, and very few people are the people identify as activists and organizers, they leap. Like, I just got in my car and ended up in Ferguson. I didn't need a ladder. I was just like, and I'm quitting my job. But most people need a ladder approach to these things. So, I'm always interested in the art that both helps people think about the problem differently and then says, here is like a list to join, a thing to read. I do think we put a lot of pressure on ourselves to give people like the key all the time. And all the people need a key. They just need a step. And like giving people one step is actually really powerful.
I know it's 2:30. DeRay, really appreciate you spending this time with us. Thank you so much.
Great fun. See you guys later.
Take care.
Maggie, like I said, I wanted to come to you and follow on that exact line. You offered such a arresting image, right, of this ice sculpture melting, right? And then you've got the clipboards nearby, I imagine. So how do you think about it in the environmental movement, as we've all been experiencing scorching temperatures? And then that's not art, that's actually the environment, Mother Earth, bearing down on us. But there's an openness, there's an awareness, and now you're seeking to capture it.
Sure. Yeah, Lucy, if you wouldn't mind putting the butter sculpture up here. I'll talk to it through butter here. So when we're talking about something like addressing the climate crisis, right, we're asking about shifting our entire energy source and the way we think about resources. And so as part of our, many named campaign to get the Inflation Reduction Act passed over the last several years, we did try to bring the call to action to places where people were already gathered around a cultural event. So This was at the Minnesota outside, not it wasn't a part of the Minnesota State Fair, but as many folks in the Midwest know, there's two things we like. We like sweet corn and we like butter.
Butter.
So Minnesota is well known for having a massive butter art display at their state fair. And our topic was too political, so we couldn't go inside. We decided to bring this butter sculpture to a beer fest that was happening in St. Paul. And so, we found an ice sculptor, gave him a call, told him about our campaign. Dusty Thune, House of Thune. They typically work with ice and snow, but he was like, this is rad. I want to be a part of this, and let's do it with butter. This is actually vegan butter, better for the environment, and actually a better sculpting material as well. But, being an artist, he said, you know what I want to do? I want to build this thing. That's 3,000 pounds of butter right there. And then I want to melt it. And so he, being, that kind of mindset, he was like, we have to melt this for people. And sure enough, the local news comes, the whole community's gathered around watching this thing melt, which we did find a use for after the fact. But,
popcorn clearly, right?
The local news zooming in on this melting butter sculpture with like drips, 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 and then the news carrying forward with the story of the day of like, the temperature's really hot out there, and just connecting it through places where, they're expected to see butter art that week. And we wanted to infuse the call to action, climate action, through that lens as well. So that's just like one input. I was talking about, feeding those inputs. And so that's an example of that. And not kind of going against the grain, but trying to get your message in through an artist's interpretation to kind of feed that along the way.
Yeah, absolutely. Really appreciate it. Ken, like I said, I was going to read from the book. Something I think you just did so skillfully. I know you said it was hard to write the book. I know it took a lot of time and it was a labor of love, but I thought besides the images that you placed in the book, there were strategic moments where you actually let art speak for itself by putting certain poems in certain places. So there's one I want to read that's short. It's a song actually called Abundance, and it goes, when you hear the word subsistence, do you think of someone poor with an outstretched hand? To us, it means abundance, living off the riches of the land. We've been here 10,000 years along this river shore. If there's any justice left, we'll be here 10,000 more. The first salmon of the season we always take and give to someone else. Any game we carry home, we feed others before ourselves. No power known can ever force me from this ancient place that gave me birth, from the richness of the river and the abundance of the earth. I wanted to give you a chance to contextualize that poem, but also, what were you thinking as you sort of wrote the book and where to place some of these strategically? Because I found that as much as I was moved by the chapter, when I read that poem, I was all in, which I thought only further reinforced what you were attempting to do.
It actually still gives me the chills to hear it 3 years into it. That was written by a guy named Cy Khan, who is a folk singer from North Carolina. And the context for it was Alaska. There was a huge battle around a place called Pebble Mine, which I know Rakim and Maggie know all about. And it pitted the extractive industries, the mining industries, against the fishing industries. And it takes place in an area, Bristol Bay is an area which is 65% indigenous. And so this was really an indigenous-led fight to stop Pebble Mine from being developed. And the scary part about Pebble Mine, in addition to the just ongoing problem with fossil fuels and the destruction of the earth, so no small thing, was that it might have totally obliterated the culture, the land, and the people who live there, because in order to build this mine, they would have had to create something called an earthen dam, which would hold 10.2 billion gallons of toxic waste from the mines. That was situated less than 100 miles from an earthquake zone. What are they called? The fault lines.
Yeah.
The fault lines for this earthquake zone in the early 1900s, it was the second largest recorded earthquake in history. It killed 132 people. It caused 26 tsunamis. And 100 miles is nothing for an earthquake to shake. That earthen dam could have exploded. And if the earthen dam exploded, the people that lived in those areas would have been wiped out. And so what Cy did is he went up to Alaska at the request of some fishermen who happened to be folk singers and said to Cy, listen, we need a campaign song. We need an anthem. Can you come up and write us an anthem? And so what they did is they took him into a third grade classroom. I think they were called Rebels of the Pebble, these kids. And he said, I will be your musical messenger if you tell me the message. And he said that as the way you would say that to a third grade class. And out of that came that song. And what Cy did, which is a second point, is he used music in very strategic ways. So he didn't just come up with an album to raise money. He came up with songs with a message, and then he would go into people's homes locally. There'd be 20 to 30 people come from the local area to hear these songs. And he would say, does this song need fixing? Because if it does, we will. Do you not like this song? Because if you don't, we won't sing it. Mm-hmm. And so musicians were embraced in this fight in a way that they hadn't been before because of their openness to collaborating with community organizers, organizations, and interests.
Thank you for sharing that story. One of the things I loved about song poem is the notion of 10,000 more, that the future is what the poem is actually looking towards. And led me to want to turn back to you, Maggie, to think about the way that art opens for us, new realities, new possibilities, new apertures. That's sort of what Ken was talking about. He was talking about the length of time that an artist might be thinking over. As art has become more infused into the environmental movement, how's it changed or shifted? What's now become incorporated into it that didn't exist before?
So I would, let's see. I don't want to say that when I was working at LCV that when we went in that direction, it moved. I think that it was natural for social justice organizations to be working in the art space over time. I think the investment factor, right? Like making those big, bold investments in art as part of your strategy is what changed for us at the time. And I'm seeing more and more of that over time now. I'm hoping to get there in my new role as well here at Prairie Rivers. But I think people naturally, when they think back at campaigns as times have changed, they'll remember those visual elements of it. They're not going to remember signing that clipboard that I was talking about earlier, that kind of thing. But those visual components are what you'll think back on in your older days of like those big kind of cultural moments for you as an individual and kind of measuring cultural change. I will say one thing that I worked on a lot at my time with League of Conservation Voters Education Fund was our democracy work. I do want to kind of show an image of, if Lizzie, if you're able to help me, thank you so much. And so this is an installation. This was in the thick of COVID, and we were trying to break through and reach people authentically, and not a lot of people were out and about at those times, but we were teaming up with our state league, Georgia Conservation Voters Education Fund. Shout out to them. They're doing incredible work all through the state of Georgia. And when we talked about this was coming up on one of the Voting Rights Act anniversaries. And we wanted to do something bold that would engage a lot of artists from the community at once. And so what we did is we did not paint this historic mural. This is in Sweet Auburn, a historic neighborhood in Atlanta, Sweet Auburn. But we use that existing mural as the backdrop because that tells a really awesome story right here. And then we commissioned about 16 local artists to design a voting booth with someone that inspired them. And there's a few John Lewis images that they painted, but a lot of people came up with quotes or imagery of other civil rights leaders. And so I think it was really a way to do something pretty big and bold during COVID when people were stuck inside. But if you think about it, there were 16 different, I think it was 16 to 18 different artists involved in this project. And they all have their own community, their own audience. And so while we were kind of all stuck at home, they were blasting out to their communities, their art, these images like for the broader exhibit, but their own personal art and stories alongside of that. So you can also think of kind of cultural organizing as a way to reach people authentically and trusting the artist knows best in terms of what their community is going to respond to. And so really, they might come up with some really unique ideas that you're like, I don't know if our, organization would go with that, but you got to trust the artist because they know who their community is and how they're going to respond to something. And so this is an example of a way to engage lots of artists at once to kind of ensure that we're spreading that message far and wide.
Sure. Ken, if you're talking, you're muted. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. I had something in my throat and I muted myself so you wouldn't hear me. I couldn't hear me. Lizzie, can you pull up slide number 4 from my deck? So I just wanted to make the same point that Maggie made in a different way. There were literally thousands of George Floyd murals created. They weren't just created in the United States. They were in Palestine. They were in Syria. They were in Australia. They were in France, globally. And what these images often did was to project the pain of a community and offer a gathering spot to grieve, and at the same time to call for action, to call for justice. Let's move to slide 5. That's slide 6. This was another from the Black Lives Matter protest. Same kind of thing, much more, really thoughtful, holding up a mirror to state power. So these kind of images also serve as an accelerant for protest. I mean, people see this, they think about what's going on, and they want to act on it. And I don't need to give a 20-minute speech. I can show this one image, 10 seconds, and everyone will automatically understand the point.
This question is sort of for both of you, but I'll start with Maggie, just because you've done this work. And I lead a nonprofit, so now I'm just asking for free advice. How is it that, how did you think about budgeting for this activity? We've got a group of different folks, but because it's the Alliance for Justice, I'm sure we've got a lot of nonprofit professionals who are joining to learn more about Ken's book and this work. And as I was reading it, I was constantly stimulated to ask the staff, how are we incorporating art? What are we doing? Remember that idea we had about incorporating more of the famous judge characters. I was like, how come we don't use more Better Call Saul gifts? That's basically free. But how did you think about it institutionally, and what part of your budget it made up, back to the point you made earlier about having tight budgets?
Right. Now I'm at a much smaller organization and trying to look in the couch over here, which I'll be successful, believe it or not. But it's tough. Like to our earlier conversation, it's outside of the traditional organizing framework mindset, and so I had to show the way, essentially, right? Like start small and do little bits, and then advocate internally. It was kind of an internal campaign to build this program up. And hopefully most people, don't have to do that if we do get the funders in alignment with kind of what Ken was saying earlier. But I think it's all scalable. So if you're like a small nonprofit like I am, or up to the bigger size of League of Conservation Voter size, like it's all scalable. You can find a chalk artist who is within your budget and can do something really big and bold in the middle of a downtown, and people will come and interact with that. You can talk about, it's all scalable is my point there. And sometimes, not to undermine, you always want to, provide resources to the artists, because it is work. And sometimes though, you'll find already within your campaign, there might be an artist on staff, right? Or someone who's looking to get a little creative, and you can tap into that as well. And so I do want to emphasize it's all scalable, and start small and work your way up. That's how I went about it.
Yeah. This is the same question for you, Ken. So I've found, I'm very aware that philanthropy is into the relationship between art and activism. But if I'm candid, I've often felt maybe not being as creative as Maggie. I was like, well, where would I go to tap this? It felt like an alien strategy to me. And so how would you bridge that between philanthropy and nonprofits, right? Philanthropists now gaining this extra energy. Folks who've already been in this practice area obviously are delighted that philanthropy is caught up in that way. But for those of us who haven't yet built out this tool set, this skill, how do we make connections?
Well, I think there are two things. One is that organizers need to approach philanthropy and make the case that absent cultural strategy, our political and organizing strategies are going to be insufficient. And secondly, I would say that there are an increasing number of funders, and people should be aware of who they are and what they fund, that are funding at the intersection of art and social justice. So Lizzie, can you pull up slide number 6? Just to illustrate this point. This is a piece by Roy Lichtenstein. He did this in 1962, and it was owned by a philanthropist named Agnes Gund. And she saw the film 13th and called up Darren Walker from the Ford Foundation and said to Darren, we need to do something about mass incarceration, because there's a long trajectory from the Atlantic slave trade to mass incarceration. What are we going to do to break this? And Darren wanted to go forward. And so Aggie called up Roy Lichtenstein's wife, Dorothy, and said, Dorothy, I've treasured this painting all of my life, but I want to do something about mass incarceration. And what do you think about me selling it? Dorothy was lifted up by the idea. Aggie sold this for $160 million and dedicated 100 of the $160 million to creating something called the Art for Justice Fund, which funds exactly at this intersection. In a different vein, there is an organization called the Pop Culture Collaborative. And what they do, they've spent, I think, $25 million over the last 5 years to get at this question of narrative change and how do we use art and culture to shift the narratives. So the Mellon Foundation, as you know, Elizabeth Alexander, who's a poet, an artist herself, who now runs the Mellon Foundation, is putting tens of millions of dollars into art and culture work. So organizers need to be sophisticated about who within philanthropy is funding, and B, we need to be sophisticated about pressing funding. So JPB Foundation is another example. Dana Borland said the reason why JPB started funding cultural work in the environmental context was because organizers said we need it and can't do it without it. So, those are just two examples.
Yeah, really appreciate that. We've got some questions coming. I'm going to do one last thing because I thought it was an important piece in the book. It's chapter 5. Again, I'll just quote something that Ken puts into the book, and it'll naturally lead in. So it's a inscription: for the hanged and beaten, for the shot, drowned, and burned, for the tortured, tormented, and terrorized, for those abandoned by the rule of law, we will remember. With hope, because hopelessness is the enemy of justice. With courage, because peace requires bravery. With persistence, because justice is a constant struggle. With faith, because we shall overcome. That's inscribed at the Equal Justice Museum, one of the Equal Justice Museums. And Ken, you decided to devote an entire chapter to just museums, which is obviously where most people actually learn about history, but also repository of large numbers of artwork. And we've seen a shift since COVID in particular in how museums are used. It's a really rich chapter that does a lot of different things. I just wanted to give you a chance to talk about why dedicate a whole chapter to that.
Thank you, Rakim. Pull up slide 7, Lizzie. I mean, it turns out that museums are one of the most trusted institutions in America. And so therefore, curators have a lot of power, this curatorial power. Museums are not neutral by any stretch of the imagination. They reflect the messages that the curators intend to project through their exhibitions. And so if we talk about community building, we have to think about what our relationship is to museums. It's not something that comes natural to organizers and legal advocates and lawyers, but they play a very important role. And I wanted to just mention 2 of them. This image is from the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, which is just outside of the Legacy Museum, about a quarter of a mile away. And on these corten steel beams that they're hanging from, I think there are 805 of these, and the names of the enslaved people that were hung and the places in which they were hung hang from these ceilings. And what the National Memorial for Peace and Justice did was to create something that they called a remembrance project, so that people that go to the National Memorial will go back to those same towns where their ancestors lived and where their ancestors were hung and enslaved, and demand a marker, a memorial, some type of recognition as to what happened. So it was the idea of putting museums into action. A second important museum exhibition was this one of Breonna Taylor. Ta-Nehisi Coates commissioned Amy Sherald to do a portrait of Breonna Taylor for Vanity Fair magazine. And the Speed Museum, which is in Louisville, Kentucky, was pretty white. Rarely did the Black community feel like they could go there. And so the museum director, Stephen Riley, asked the question, of what would it take to respond to the moment, to respond to George Floyd, to Breonna Taylor, to white police officers killing Black and brown young men and women. And so what they did was they created two advisory boards. One was a national advisory board of artists who have had family members killed. And one was a local advisory board made up of community health experts, legal advocates, organizers, and so forth. And those advisory boards drove what the exhibition looked like. It wasn't a question of the curators deciding what the community ought to see, but rather the community deciding what they wanted to see. And so there are a lot of ways where institutions can open themselves up to become places for community, to build communities. And I wanted to demonstrate some of that through this chapter.
This has been really wonderful. I know we only have a little time left, so I wanted to open it up for questions. There's one that I know Ken will be able to talk to because it's a whole chapter basically dedicated to documentary film. But the question was, could you talk a little bit about the intentional efforts to harness the power of art and storytelling to engage people and move them to action? You sort of walked through a history really beautifully, and maybe we could just take a second on that.
Sure. So let me juxtapose two films. One is called The China Syndrome, and one is called 9 to 5. Jane Fonda produced both of them. Jane Fonda starred in both of them. In The China Syndrome, she was joined by Michael Douglas and some other folks. And what The China Syndrome did was talk about nuclear power and the threat that it posed. And when it came out, not 12 days later, 3 Mile Island happened. 3 Mile Island was a nuclear generating station, and it created the largest exposure to nuclear radiation that America has seen. And so the film captured everyone's attention. Box office receipts were 9 times the production cost of the film, and it made it big. But what it didn't do really was contribute to the movement to support anti-nuclear work. Unlike 9 to 5, I'm sort of jumping ahead here because I'm looking at the clock again.
Of course.
9 to 5, Jane Fonda used that and said she felt like her movie was married to a movement. And so 9 to 5, people know Dolly Parton's song 9 to 5. They know it's a song about secretaries taking matters into their own hands. They know it's a comedy. And 9 to 5, the organization of women, used this film and doubled the number of chapters that they had during the period that film came out. So one was a really strong impact campaign, and one was not an impact campaign, but a film which raised the ideas. Both of these things are important. One is in the individual realm, and one is in the collective.
Yeah, thank you for that. Maggie, I wanted to maybe give you the close to last word. I'll take some final thoughts from both of you. But what do you see as the next frontier of arts and arts activism in the environmental movement? Or what are you experimenting with to the extent you want to share that?
Yeah. Here's my plug. So I came home to Illinois from DC after 16 years in working in climate in DC after helping to pass the IRA, and wanted to go home to implement it. And on top of that, Illinois, a coal state, has its own statewide climate legislation, and it's one of the most equitable and just pieces of legislation in all the land focused on this work. Since we are a coal state, we need to make sure that those coal communities are moving forward as well. And so I'm here to say that while the temperatures keep rising, the transition is happening. These pieces of legislation are working, but we need to tell that story right now. We need to do it through art. We need to do it through storytelling. We need to do it through video and poems. We need to capture this moment because it is happening. And people, as they are, facing 100+ temperatures every day, as they are facing massive floods, they need something to inspire them for this moment that we're living through, because it's not pretty, right? And so right now, I'm begging folks to kind of get on board with this work right now, because we have a moment in time to kind of make this jump. And I think that component of it is not fully funded just yet. So I'll end there. Funding note.
No, I listen, nonprofit ED, I get it. So Ken, we started with you. I want to end with you. Again, the book is Artworks, How Organizers and Artists Are Creating a Better World Together. Any parting reflections or thoughts from our conversation or from the project as a whole? As I've noted, it took you a while to get to this place. It is your first book, and I'm sure a major part of your career at this stage.
Just to say that what Maggie did at LCV was to integrate cultural strategies with LCV's organizing strategies. And that's really what we're talking about here. The labor movement, which is a whole nother webinar, often uses artists to support their work, but they don't develop an in-house mechanism for art like Maggie did at LCV. So my parting words is for those of you that are in organizations that are on the webinar today, that's the direction in which we need to think. We need to have artists on our boards, believe it or not. We need to have artists on our staff. And so there are a lot of people now that are doing this kind of work that can help organizations think strategically about funding for this, about what it would take, and about how to, I don't know if it's a transition, but how to embrace art and culture in their legal and political work.
Well, again, this has been Hold in Court. My name is Rakim Brooks. I'm president of the Alliance for Justice, and we're just so grateful to Ken Grossinger, our author and activist, who's written this really wonderful book, Maggie, for offering so many contextual examples. And earlier, for those of you who missed it, DeRay Mckesson joined us for the first half of the conversation about how art works in service of social justice. I hope you'll join us again next time. And Ken and Maggie, thank you once more.